Well, good morning, everyone. It's my pleasure to welcome all of you to Riggs Library, one of our most beautiful spaces here on campus, a place where our community has come together so often over the course of our university's history to engage in dialogue and reflection. And during our time together this morning, our conversation will focus on the issue of educational access for our world's young people. Before we begin, I wish to recognize a few distinguished guests who join us this morning. We're pleased to welcome His Excellency Sheikh Mishal bin Hamad Al Thani, the Ambassador of the State of Qatar to the United States. Mr. Ambassador, I want to thank you for joining us today. Also, Dr. Ahmed Hasna, the President of Hamad bin Khalifa University, Dr. Joel Hellman, the Dean of our School of Foreign Service, and Dr. Ahmed Dalal, Dean of our School of Foreign Service in Doha. We're also joined today by so many colleagues from the Qatar Foundation and the Education Above All Foundation. I want to thank you all for being here. We're honored to welcome all of you to our campus today, and especially three remarkable leaders who are each working at the forefront of this global issue. And it's a privilege to be joined by Her Highness Sheikh Moza bin Nasser, who serves as chairperson of the Qatar Foundation for Education, Science, and Community Development, as well as founder and chairperson of Education Above All, a global initiative established in 2012 that addresses the educational needs of children affected by poverty, conflict, and disaster, and also serves as a UNESCO Special Envoy for Basic and Higher Education. We're joined by Dr. Ala Mur Abid, a medical doctor and UN High-Level Commissioner on Health, Employment, and Economic Growth, who was appointed in 2016 by the UN Secretary General as one of 17 global sustainable development goal advocates, along with Her Highness, and Ambassador Milan Verveer, Executive Director of our Institute for Women, Peace, and Security here at Georgetown, and Special Representative on Gender Issues for the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe. I want to thank you all for being with us today. In our world today, millions of children and adults face significant barriers to education. UNESCO reports that today 750 million adults remain illiterate, 2/3 of whom are women, and 250 million children are denied access to education. Among marginalized populations, the challenges are even more significant. We also know that only 6 in 10 refugee children attend primary school, compared to 9 in 10 globally. In the context of higher education, only 3 in every 10 refugees are able to pursue learning, compared with a world average of 37 in 100. During conflict, the challenge grows. A recent United Nations report found that attacks on schools and hospitals had a significant impact on access to education and to health services for thousands of children impacted by more than 1,000 incidents of violence. These are unprecedented challenges, and yet the resources and frameworks available to us to face these challenges have never been stronger. This is why we gather in forums just as this one. This is why it's so valuable for us to be able to come together like we do this morning. Movements such as Education Above All, founded by Her Highness Sheikh Moza bin Nasser, have helped bring necessary attention to the barriers that children face to education, with a specific focus on areas and communities affected by poverty, conflict, and disaster. And initiatives like our own Institute for Women, Peace, and Security here at Georgetown are providing resources and research examining the critical role and access to education has in encouraging women's participation in society and advancing economic opportunity. And in just a few days, leaders from around our world will gather for the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals Summit in New York. And during this gathering, heads of state and government will have the opportunity to take a comprehensive look at our global community's progress toward the 2030 Sustainable Development Goals set by the United Nations in 2015, and of which Her Highness and Dr. Murabit serve as advocates. One of these goals, ensuring inclusive and quality education for everyone around the world. This gathering is a wonderful opportunity for discussion and provides a context for us to better understand the unique contributions and concerns of young people who face barriers to basic education. And I'm grateful to each of you here, as well as others across our Georgetown community and around our world who are working every day to advance our global conversations on this important issue. So now I'll take a moment to join our panelists on stage and begin our conversation. Okay. All right. Your Highness, welcome back to campus. Let me just put this here. Okay. Well, we're so grateful to have you here and to have this opportunity to engage with you in this conversation. So we'll have the first question. From your experience over these years, why is it that the protection of education is so important in conflict? And what do we risk by failing to address the concerns about education and points of conflict?
Thank you, Dr. DeGioia. First, let me say that I'm so delighted to be back in Georgetown. Thank you for this invitation. Actually, I was in Georgetown, Qatar, a few months ago, exactly in April. We celebrated then the first academic 100 publications, and it was truly a milestone. And also, if you allow me, I want to take this opportunity to thank Georgetown for accepting our young Qatari student, Amna Shahwani. Amna, unfortunately, her education was interrupted because of the blockade enforced on her by our neighboring blockading countries. Thanks to Georgetown, they intervened immediately and accepted her as a Hoya. I know that this is in alignment with your long-standing mission, but I also see it as a testimony to your ethics and values. So thank you very much. I agree with you that, unfortunately, the education is the first victim when it comes to provision of services during war. The thing is that we are here in Georgetown, and I know that we all believe in the power of education, importance of education, education that provides cognitive skills necessarily to human development, provides economic opportunities that are essential for economic growth, not just for individuals, but also for their countries. Education that also encourages positive behaviors and attitudes. And for all these reasons, I think it is even more important to protect education during conflict time and post-conflict. During conflict time, education provides this sense of normalcy, sense of continuity, of sustainability, importance for these young people not to lose hope. Education also protects these young minds from indoctrinations to extreme groups and ideologies. The schools and the school environments provide social support, important and necessarily to alleviate some symptoms of traumas. So education also important for post-conflict time because these young educated leaders will come back to their country to first of all, to break the cycle of violence, to rebuild their countries, to redesign new sets of values, to reconstruct their social contracts. We've seen that happening in Somalia. I had the chance to meet with the Somali Prime Minister, and he himself was a refugee. Actually, not him alone, but the whole team with him, around him, they were all refugees. They were lucky to continue their education, and they went back to Somalia to support and help in nation building. But unfortunately, not everyone as these people. I have seen also Syrian children of 14, 15 years old who cannot read and write, not even their names. And I would say that the situation of these children can be applicable to the children in Libya, children in Yemen. So I think we are adding to the number that you just mentioned, Dr. DeGioia, the 750 million illiterate adults. The entire generation will lack basic skills needed for productive citizens if we don't intervene and protect education.
Thank you. Your Highness, as we've touched on, millions of people around the world today face significant barriers to education. The scale of the problem is immense, and for many hearing this, it could seem insurmountable. What can be done to protect education?
This is a very good question, but I believe that every one of us have a role to play, individually and also collectively. Well, policymakers can prioritize, can protect, can provide equitable access to education. World leaders must be responsible of holding perpetrators of attacks on education responsible and accountable. But we cannot wait. I think we need to act and act immediately. We need to be innovative in our thinking of the problem and how to solve it. We see this kind of innovation all the time in the private sectors when it is driven by the return of investments. So why not to bring this kind of creative thinking to the education during conflict times to address these challenges? I mean, why? Maybe we need to rethink education during time of conflicts and how to deliver them in better way. But I know that we spoke together, Dr. DeJoy, about the online and digital learning, which is, I think, is amazing. This is, I mean, this is a breakthrough for technology and for education and supporting education all times. But I think innovation is not just about technology. Here in universities such as Georgetown, we really need maybe to extend our research to provide deep knowledge on how to do this in a better way. I truly don't have all the answers, but we are here in Georgetown, the hub of knowledge and innovation. Maybe we do. Maybe Georgetown should take the lead and define, develop, and also put in motion new approaches to this problem. Why not?
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Okay, Ambassador Verveer, there are many approaches that we could take to fostering sustainable peace and global security, yet one theme emerges, and that's the importance of ensuring that women are empowered participants in our global community. In your experience leading our Georgetown Institute for Women, Peace, and Security, why is it so difficult to educate young girls in some parts of the developing world, and why is it so important for us to learn how to close this gap?
Well, thank you, Jack, and let me add my welcome to you, Your Highness. You know, I'm trying to think, I think it was 15, 16 years ago, I first heard Her Highness speak at the United Nations when she took on this challenge, Education for All, and it has over the years developed with a level of commitment and passion that I think is just extraordinary. So it is wonderful that you're putting all of your talents and resources to this cause. And Ala is just an extraordinary leader, particularly for women who are in conflict areas. She's a physician, and she has done yeoman's work in her native Libya, which is another very, very tough challenge. But to your question, Jack, you know, education for all is all, boys and girls, of course, and men and women. And we see today, I think the good news story, and there is some good news, is that the gap is closing, particularly for primary education for boys and girls. It's something like 2/3 closed. But the reality is that we still have a long way to go, and particularly this primary education challenge is focused in certain areas, sub-Saharan Africa, the Middle East, South Asia, where there is still the largest gaps in primary education and the gaps between boys and girls. And, you know, educating a girl, and I worked with Larry Summers over the years, and I think it was back in the 80s when he was a young economist at the World Bank, he did one of the definitive studies on why educate a girl, which sounds like, well, it's a no-brainer, right? But the reality is it's still a tough challenge. And to this day, the data has just grown, exponentially grown, as to why this is one of the most effective returns on investment in development. And yet we have 1.5 times more girls out of school than in school, despite the fact that what the data shows is you have a sharp decline in infant and maternal mortality when a girl is educated. You have better nutrition standards for her and her eventual family. You have her income go up when she works, and for every year that she's in school, her prospects are stronger, and that devolves to her society, to the economy of her country. And you have just so many reasons why it is known to be one of the most effective tools. And when she comes to have, becomes an adult, she doesn't marry early, she postpones that and spaces her children more. So it's a strong developmental, of strong developmental importance for countries to move where they need to go. Now, what are the barriers? And there are a lot of barriers. You know, one of them clearly is the cost. Parents can't afford, even when it's a token cost comparatively, to send their girls to school. There are all kinds of incentives today that I think are showing good results, conditional cash transfers, where the money has to go to send your children to school, your daughter to school especially, efforts to provide food, bags of flour, incentives that will say to that parent, I now have the wherewithal to make this possible for my child. But you have a bigger constraint, and this goes to the constraint in conflict areas as well, and that's the cultural constraint. The fact that in too many families, still, the girl is not to be educated. She's to stay home. She's to take care of the family chores. She's to care for her siblings. The boy, if he gets an education, he gets the education. She's the burden. And you see the son preference even playing out and skewing demographics in a number of countries. So we have to deal with this cultural issue. I visited a project a couple of years ago where, because one of the big challenges today is child marriage. 37,000 girls every day are coerced into child marriage. Now, that life is snuffed out. The IRC did a big study on girls, refugee girls, and what we found in Syrian refugee girls is that this child marriage problem is enormous because the fathers want to protect their girls. They think one way to protect them is to put them in these marriages that basically end the girl's life. So incentive programs like deeding an animal to the girl in her name, but it's for use of her family. And in many places now where the parent, usually the father, wants his girl to be out of the house and someone else taking care of her. There was this case I saw where the girl said, my dad wanted me to leave school. And she said, I didn't want to leave school. It was the most extraordinary thing that was happening in my life. I loved it. I saw a future. And they went back and forth, arguing. And finally, in desperation, she said to her father, well, if I go, the goat goes. And he said, oh, no, that's for the family. She said, no, it's in my name. So in development work, and I know there are a lot of students here, there are all these creative ways that folks are working, experts are working to figure out how do we keep these girls in school despite the cultural constraints and sometimes the misguided religious interpretation of why they shouldn't be in school. And just in terms of that piece, I often wonder why a girl with a book is so threatening. Look at Boko Haram and what it's about. Look at the Taliban and what they did when they were ruling Afghanistan. Look at Malala taking a bullet just to go to school. So we have to understand these cultural inhibitions that also buttress these problems. And then there's a host of practical issues. Safe transportation, the distance, you can't have girls walking, the violence that they are constantly surrounded by in school, in their homes, going to school. So yes, it is critically important. Yes, there are significant barriers and we have to address them.
Talk a little bit about the stakeholders, those who have a capacity to improve greater equity regarding education enrollment for women and girls. What more can be done to ensure equity in education as part of our global dialogue when it comes to conflict and post-conflict issues?
I think Her Highness has been an extraordinary voice on this because she has, as she did just minutes ago, remind us that everybody has a role in this. And I think we think rightly, it's government's responsibility, the multilaterals are involved, the experts are involved, the obvious people who need to be at the table need to focus on this more significantly as a priority. But there are other parties that I think are really important. One are religious leaders, particularly in some significant contexts. You know, Afghanistan has been a very hard place, riddled by conflict, a war that's gone on for America's longest war, for sure, at this point. And girls being deprived of an education was seen as one of the things that has to change if that country is ever going to become stable with a better future. And there's a woman, she's not unique in this respect, but Sakina Yakubi, when she was trying to get girls to be educated in Afghanistan, to build schools, where did she go? She went to the imams. And she said, I want the school to be in the courtyard. I want it to be nearby. I want it to be protected. And many challenged her and said, no, this is against our religion. And she had a very battered copy of the Quran, and she showed them this was not against the religion. Today, her schools are standing and still in place and providing education. I think fathers, men, male champions, absolutely critical to change this cultural dynamic. I was on a panel with Malala's father. It was extraordinary to watch the impact he had with an audience because he was a man speaking to these values in a situation which was not always hospitable. And lastly, I would just point out, as Her Highness did, the private sector. We've done case studies at the Institute focused on, for example, what companies are doing in northern Nigeria, which is a battle zone in many ways, to keep girls in school and then to ensure that they get into the value chains for gainful employment. But increasingly, companies, and you just last week in the United States had the Business Roundtable say our goal is not just to our shareholders, that's important, but we have a social responsibility. And for the first time in these Sustainable Development Goals, the last goal is partnerships, collaborations, private sector significant in this. So we have to look at this as has been said, in a way I think that is innovative, where we really do think more creatively about where are the competencies, where are the resources, and how are we going to work better together.
Thank you. Thank you. Dr. Mervit, in introducing the panel, I mentioned that you're a UN high-level commissioner on health, employment, and economic growth, and you also serve as a UN Global Sustainable Development Goals advocate. And you're also, as Ambassador Verveer said, trained as a medical doctor. Can you speak a little bit about the intersection of healthcare access and education access?
No, I think it's an incredibly important point. As Ambassador Verveer was saying, kind of the intersectionality of the challenges, and as both panelists have said, the intersectionality of the solutions. And one of the greatest things we've seen is, in the past 40 to 50 years, our interpretation of a security threat has widened significantly. Pre-Cold War and during the Cold War, it was very much believed that security threats were predominantly military, surveillance, military, very traditional in that sense. And in the past 15 to 20 years, what we've seen is an emergence of this space, where we're talking about global pandemics, we're talking about migration, we're talking about climate change as a threat multiplier. We're talking about all of these things as a fundamental reality of how we view security and stability for our own countries. And yet when we approach challenges, we are still looking at the solutions in a very myopic way. We still approach them with our traditional understanding of security. And so one of the things we haven't talked about yet that I think is very important is to overemphasize that ultimately education is about power. It does come down to it is part of a peace building infrastructure that you need for a country to be able to sustain and maintain political, social, and economic power in its own space. We know that statistically, we know that empirically, we know that together education and healthcare are actually the most likely causes of long-term security and stability. Not surveillance, not arms sales, but education and healthcare. And Ambassador Verveer mentioned the implications that education has, for example, on a woman's health, on a girl's health. We know that climate change, the two most impactful practical things we can start doing today to reverse climate change, are women's health and girls' education. So the relationship is so strong, and a lot of corporations know that. That's why they incentivize your employees working out, right? Because they know you'll come more alert and more aware and more excited for work and you'll get more done. So we know the relationship between health and having a stable, dignified life are very clear. Where education becomes really important is, and I'm so glad I'm sitting next to these two incredible women because both of them have done so much work in this space, but when we look at women, peace, and security and the inclusion of women in peace building, a huge part of it has been driven by a lot of political narratives of women's inclusion and security and focusing on girls' education. And at the very same time, we still have governments which claim feminist foreign policies, but at the very same time are still contributing to a global arms race that has led to a lot of insecurity that we have in the world. So what we need to start doing, I think, is not only inviting more people to the table, but keeping them accountable. When we look at a country that is in conflict, can we see that the infrastructure for actual health reproach doesn't exist? So if we're talking about girls going to school and young men having opportunities and all of that, do we recognize that we actually need mental health support to a significant degree to actually be able to sustain that change? That it cannot be a parachute in, bring in organizations, have the international community focus on this country for 1-2 years until another global crisis happens and then everybody parachutes out. Because that creates the vacuums that actually allow for a lot of these extremist groups and a lot of the local challenges to really be amplified. So I think it's important to ask what infrastructure exists and then how do we support local leaders? There are only one group of people that stay in conflict. And they are the people who have to. People who can leave, people who have alternative opportunities, a lot of international development workers, a lot of governments, they don't tend to stay. We know for a fact that when women are involved, particularly mothers and teachers, doctors, we see a significant change in the security of that local community. So how are we empowering and amplifying local leaders? How are we calling on them to architect projects? And I'll give you a very quick example. I sit on the board for an education organization. And years ago, when I was in Libya, and I always tell the story, an international NGO came in and said, we'd like to educate 2,000 girls. This is our budget. We want to educate 2,000 girls. And I said, well, but Libya has a very high literacy rate. The girls are in school. Education is not the issue. I think we can direct that money to something that will help the community a lot more, and that can really buttress and support education in the long term. No, our budget is to educate 2,000 girls. That's what we need. And so I brought in a lot of moms from the community who said, no, our issue isn't education. We'd actually like, and it was interesting when you mentioned all of the we'd like better sanitation in the schools. That's what we'd like. We'd like infrastructural support. That's not what our budget is for. We'll go find another NGO that'll work on this with us. And I think that's an example of how we try to parachute and copy-paste in solutions without recognizing that if we're fundamentally looking at education as a priority, which we unfortunately don't, if we're looking at it as important as our security systems and our surveillance, if we're looking at it as fundamentally as we should be and recognizing the power it has in really amplifying and sustaining a society, then we have to be looking at the local challenges. Every country is different. Every region is different. I mean, we're talking a lot about international conflict, but we don't even need to go far. There are parts of the United States where we're seeing significant impact on education and where we know firsthand in those communities where education is challenged, we have higher epidemics, higher drug epidemic rates, we have lower life expectancy, we have lower income. We recognize there's a lot more challenge to the local community. So we see this happening even down the street. It's not something we're not aware of. The question is, where is the political will to actually say education is as much a priority as everything else?
Thank you. Thank you. You've discussed and described a bit the interconnection between education and healthcare. How about the role that education plays with the other 16 Sustainable Development Goals? You've got gender equity, economic growth, climate action. How do you see education fitting, and what challenges should we be most attentive to in 2020?
You know, I think I'm very glad you asked this. I think the Sustainable Development Goals get their strength from being very intersectional at a time when our political vision is often very siloed and isolated. And one of the greatest, and I always call it the triangle to me, it's healthcare, education, and gender equality. What we've seen statistically is if we can actually get the building blocks of healthcare and education, you impact every other sustainable development goal to a significant degree. So from, sustainable cities to climate change. If you're looking at partnerships, if you're looking at poverty, if we're looking at, things like food supply, if we're able to actively activate communities through education, you're able to actually ensure that they are then self-resourced. They are capable of actually meeting the needs in their local community. And more than that, we talk a lot about, part of our job is to give the economic argument for education, right? Like if we educate, girls, it's greater economic growth than China and India combined. And that's one of our big pushes. And we say, this is why you should invest in it. And it'll make your corporation more successful. And a good example is Unilever that has put women at the highest levels and noticed significant return. So the challenge here, though, is I don't think that should have to be our argument. I really don't. I know it sounds very Pollyanna, but I think what we should fundamentally be able to say is without education, the same way we all have the opportunity to sit at Georgetown, because we've been given those opportunities in life, it should not have to be a privilege. We should not have to assume that we need to debate the merits of education based on the economic output. What we should be able to say is, fundamentally, it allows for every single person to live a dignified life. And I think that's what the basis of the Sustainable Development Goals is. It is the belief that every single person is deserving of a dignified life. And if we're not centering on the importance of education and healthcare, if we're not saying you deserve the right to have your own independent ability to understand the world and interpret it and participate in it, then it's very difficult for us to then go to a young student or a young kid and ask them to be politically active or ask them to engage in economic growth, because they don't feel any of that ownership. It's not something they're equally invested in. So I think a fundamental, and the reason that I so fundamentally believe in the Sustainable Development Goals is because of the belief that every person is deserving of a dignified life, and I think education is the full stop beginning of it. If you ask anybody who has achieved great success in life, they'll always go back to like, oh, my teacher, or my parents were really invested in my education, or, in school I learned this. And I have 10 brothers and sisters. Alhamdulillah. And yes, everyone is giving prayers to my mother. Good job. But out of my 10 brothers and sisters, when people ask, and they often do even in my own local community, why do you believe in what you believe in? Why are you so committed to it, et cetera? It all comes back to the fact that my mom, who was a child bride, was so fundamentally committed to education. That was it for her. She believed she saw everybody who was able to get out of a bad situation was able to get out because of their degree or because they had learned or because they were reading books. And her and my father always pointed to the fact that when you look at authoritarian regimes, or when you look at regimes that are attempting to really own and control a population, the first thing they throw out is the books. They attack the schools and they throw out the books, because an educated population is dangerous to a lot of authoritarians. And so I think we have to look at that in the same way. We look at education as a checkbox exercise, and we have to start seeing it as central to our agenda.
Thank you. Thank you very much. As people were making their commitments to attend today, we opened up the opportunity for people to post some questions. So I'm now going to go to questions from our audience. So this is first a question for Her Highness from a student from our School of Foreign Service. Your Highness, what motivated you to take on the initiative of educating millions of children around the world? And how would you describe its successes?
Thank you for the question. Well, I have faith in education. I know that everyone else here in this room have the same faith. We set the goal for ourselves to reach out to 10 million children who are then out of schools. The time frame was between 5 to 6 years. We were able to achieve our goal in 6 years. We're happy with our achievements, but success, I don't know if really we're successful, because we still have 65 million children out there who need our help and support. So I think we need to not to be complacent with our achievements, and try to exert ourselves more and reach out to more children and do it in a better way. I think this is summarize the whole journey of a few years, 15 years, was it 15 years? Thank you.
Thank you. And this is another question for you. This comes from a graduate student in our Department of Government who asks, if you could highlight one key lesson learned from supporting the education of children in conflict zones, what would it be?
Well, it's difficult to highlight one lesson, but I would say there are several lessons that I learned myself throughout this journey. But the most important lesson that I myself learned is that there is no one size fits all. I mean, as the panelists just mentioned here, that there are different situations and different countries with different dynamics, and there are different barriers to education, especially education in conflict time. There are cultural barriers, there are economic barriers, there are political barriers as well. So we need to be creative and innovative when it comes to dealing with these different situations. We were, in a way, selective in our approach and also eclectic. By this, I mean that we took certain models from success stories, and we try to compose them in a way that can be applicable to the different situations. Imams, clerks, one of the elements that we tried really to communicate with. Children, parents, economic barrier is one of the important elements here. And the thing is that I think yes, we should not measure the situation of education by economic elements, but unfortunately we are not living in a perfect world here. People need to see figures. Politicians want to see the return on their GDPs. So we need to be realistic sometimes, and to deal with these people in a different way, or that in a way that and in a dialogue that really can convince them to engage them in this conversation. So I think it's very important to understand these different situations and different dynamics, and in a way tailor different communications for different situations. But I must say something very important as well, mentioned here before as well, that partnerships is very important, collaboration is very important. I mean, we didn't do that alone. We've done it with collaborative efforts. I mean, we've done it with partners from different kind of foundations, sanitations. I do believe also this in multi-sectoral approach. So we partnered with different foundations specialized in different sectors, like health, sanitation, energy. And with this kind of collaboration and partnerships, we were able to not just to achieve our goals, but also to accelerate the process. That's why we achieved it in 6 years.
Thank you. Thank you very much. So this is an audience question for the two of you. We had a number of questions focused on the important elements of education above all. For example, how does this include vocational training, addressing cultural competency, ensuring attention to special education, the differences between primary and secondary education, and education for refugees? Can you each describe how we can ensure an inclusive approach to education for all?
Well, this is one of those very challenging areas because, as Her Highness just said, we need different kinds of approaches in different kinds of circumstances based on the individual, where he or she finds herself. And it's all of the above. So it's very interesting. We've been talking about the Sustainable Development Goals. The goal on education, Goal 4, is about quality, it's about equity, and it's about inclusion. And it's about lifelong learning, which I think is very interesting as the work was being done to propound this goal, that it was including all of the things and then some that you mentioned, Jack. And when you look at all of these goals, and 4 is no exception, has targets where we need to go, and then indicators, what is going to show us that we are getting there. So the targets are multifaceted targets. It's primary and secondary. It's vocational skills development, that whole basket of knowledge and tools to be able to hold a job, have a better future. It includes the cultural aspects. I think, again, Your Highness, you have talked about this concept of civic education, global education, which is an important ingredient. Human rights, education for peace, the appreciation of cultures, how all of that plays together. Issues having to do with the training of teachers and the availability of resources for tertiary education. So it's a very, very comprehensive view of education. We have the indicators to tell us where we're going, and it's a very, very big challenge. Conflict, refugees, people with disabilities, what do we need to be doing to infrastructure to ensure they not only can be educated as they deserve to be, but that the education is available to them. So I think for sure government has a responsibility, and we have to work harder to ensure that governments are fulfilling their responsibilities. But a lot of it has to do with priorities. Do they see this as a priority? Are they budgeting accordingly? Are their budgets representing that they see this as a value for their societies and where they want those societies to go? Are they working, as you've heard over and over here, collaboratively and in coordination with the multilaterals, with NGOs, with the private sector? Because that is also critically important in the delivery. So to get there, we have to get there comprehensively, different emphases in different places, but it's holistic. But we also need to understand that we have to unleash this sense of prioritization and investment that is going to be required. And then it's going to be about accountability, evaluation. Really, is this happening? And I just want to mention again the other SDG 5, which is gender equality, and how critical that is to this education piece, and we already talked about that. And 17, which is partnerships. And that is really an extraordinary, I think, reflection of where the United Nations has moved in many respects, that it's not just we alone. It's a more holistic way that various stakeholders across society have to be focused on these issues. And I just want to say to you, Alla, that, she was very passionate about each person and their human dignity and what is required. Fundamentally so, I couldn't agree more. But the reality is, when you're in government, you have got to find those ways that you're going to persuade your peers that these are investments they've got to make. And I'll tell you, self-interest is the driving consideration. What is it going to do for me to be more effective in my job? And so we've had to say, it's not just the right thing to do. It is absolutely the right thing to do, but it's the smart thing to do. And that, to certain parties, has more appeal, I regret to say, than the right thing to do.
No, believe me, I know. Believe me. But what we're not saying here is that to certain parties, the economic growth of another country and the sustainability of another country is not necessarily very appealing. And so it can actually deter them from doing work on education in that country. That's also very important to note, right? So one country's interests are not necessarily another's. And oftentimes when you argue, well, no, this will lead to economic development and it will lead to sustainability for this country and they'll have more regional power, it's a lot less likely that countries will mobilize and move to support that local community. So it goes both ways. One thing I will say that I think is incredibly important when we're looking at kind of the intersectionality of the response is accountability. So I'm going to, because my brain does this, I'm going to take you to a medical question. When you have a patient who comes in with an infection on their arm, relatively deep infection, if you're a doctor, you are not allowed to answer. What is the first thing you would do? Feel free. What would you do? As a medical doctor, a patient comes in with an infection.
Antibiotics.
Antibiotics, okay. So we want to treat the body, right?
Am I allowed to answer first
Yes,
of all?
yes, you're allowed. Feel free, feel free. Just the doctors. This is reverse
I'm
exclusion.
sticking with her, though. You aren't very helpful here.
So,
It's,
yeah, honestly, guys, I mean, I would not want to come to an infection to any of you guys. But, okay, so a history, right? So what we're going to do is a patient comes in with an infection. And if you're going to your doctor, you're going to hope that they ask you some pretty fundamental questions. When did this happen? How did this happen? And then you're going to hope, if they're a good doctor, they will take a culture so they can give you the right antibiotics. And if they're an excellent doctor, which luckily a lot are, they're going to debride. And what debride means is they will literally pick out the infection bit by bit so it doesn't get into your bones. And what does that do? In a few weeks, it'll prevent you from coming back and needing an amputation, right? Because your infection has not now spread into your bones. Now, Milan's like, what does this have to do with education? I'm getting there. I just...
How difficult this is for some of us who are less able to think about these infections.
But
and what they
I think it's so incredibly important because medicine is in a way, separates the kind of subjective nature from the objective. And the objective is to make sure the patient is okay in the long term. And in that effort, you are going to do sometimes the most expensive, most time-intensive, most expert-intensive thing, but you will get to the root of the problem. You will not, as a good doctor, put a bandage on it and tell the person to come back in 3 weeks. Because in the long run, they'll lose an arm, it'll cost you more, and it'll be a lot worse for everyone. And in politics, unfortunately, what we do is we are experts at the Band-Aid solution. We're experts at it. We're like, oh, there's a conflict and kids are out of school? Let's build local tents where they'll get temporary education for a year or two while we still have some funding for it. And then we'll look at this again in 2 years. We very rarely say, wait, how did this happen? Are we talking about the underlying causes of conflict? Are we keeping ourselves accountable? 193 countries signed on to the Sustainable Development Goals. 193 countries, which means there's a fundamental global agreement on the importance of peace building and on the importance of strong institutions and healthcare and education. And so if we notice that these are protracted conflicts where we're losing not 1, not 2, but 3, 4 generations, how are we holding ourselves accountable? Are we taking a history? Are we doing the really difficult body treatment of that antibiotic? Are we not just looking at the local, but looking at the regional, the more general challenges that exist? And unfortunately, in education, we don't. So it's very difficult. Whoever asked the question on people with disabilities and mental health, and it's incredibly difficult. It is, because when you do Band-Aid solutions, you do the least you can do. So you go in and you say, we're going to give you education. We're going to give you arithmetic and reading. We're going to make sure you're literate. Very rarely do we go in with the resources and the budgets to say, we're also going to ensure mental health. We're also going to talk to you about reproductive rights. We're also going to talk about disabilities. Very rarely do you even have the ecosystem and the expertise in that local community to do that. So it does come down to accountability and prioritization. It does come down to saying people are deserving not only of 12 years of school, but people are deserving of 12 years of school. And the same way, if you were a patient in a hospital, going in with a traumatic experience, and you would hope that your doctor would give you the medical treatment, but also, yes, refer you to a psychologist. Help your family through that support. That same holistic approach that we give one another in medicine, we need to be able to give in education. We need to be able to say we don't just treat the person, we treat the problem.
Thank you. Thank you. I'd now like to invite our panelists to offer some closing reflections, and we'll start with Ambassador Verveer, and then Dr. Mirabeet, and we'll conclude with Her Highness.
Well, I think if you were listening to this, you would rightly conclude this is a very challenging topic because it has to be played out and addressed in so many different ways with levels of expertise and commitment. But I want to end where it began with what Her Highness said about conflict-affected areas, fragile states, refugees. Today, we have more displaced people, either internally displaced or as refugees, in the world than at any time in recorded history. This is a humongous problem. We see it in the way it's playing out. Governments are being affected. Stresses are being imposed, but we're not really in the process, I don't think, thinking very much about education. And the fact that 5 times less likely is it that a child caught up or an adolescent caught up in a conflict is going to get an education. And think about his or her life, having to move in flight, having to find a place to be settled. And then usually it's in a host country that itself is a developing country that doesn't have the resources for its own people in the way it would like, and now has another larger number of people that it needs to address. Today, we are going to see more and more, I can't call them climate refugees because the term refugee is not really incorporating those who are displaced by virtue of what the climate consequences are. So we don't even have a way to address what's going to happen with these displaced people in international law and in international humanitarian law. But more and more are being displaced. As lakes are drying up, as there is no viable income, as we see these consequences, we are going to see more displacement. And we might not call them conflicts, we might not call them wars, but we are going to see massive numbers of people moving. And how are we going to address this, and how are we going to incorporate this? And lastly, I would just add that we at the Institute have focused in many respects on adolescent girls in these contexts, because for the reasons that I said earlier, their challenges are really significant. And we have to understand, and I think this is also where, Your Highness, you've been forward-reaching, to understand that they need to have their psychosocial challenges addressed. They need to be able to be kept safe because of all of the different kinds of violence around them. But they also need to be skilled and get the tools to be able to move forward, because this is going to be critical to rebuilding their countries. And in that context, I think we really need to be more innovative. We've done a study with Cambridge University looking at these gaps and looking particularly at solutions. They are there. It's not large numbers, but we have to think more creatively. What is working? What is replicable to other places? How do we scale it? And how do we really think about the things that we're still not doing to make their lives better?
Thank you. Dr. Mirabeet?
No, I wholeheartedly agree with that. I think because we've laid out a lot of the challenges, and I think a lot of the multi-sectoral solutions, I think it's also important to lay out some of the individual solutions. And so, I fundamentally believe not everybody has to go and join an institute or lead a foundation. I think many of us in our individual capacities want to know, okay, so what can I do about this global problem? Like, what can I actively do? And where is my agency in this? Because I do believe we all have power and agency in this conversation. And I think there's 3 key things I would point out. The first is that many of us get to keep our countries and our governments accountable. That's literally one of the best things about, our Canadian election is coming up very soon and I get to vote and I'm so excited because I get to ask, wait, what are you doing for education globally? What are you doing for healthcare? Where are our resources going? Because I think when we talk about priority, money tells you quite a bit about a country's priorities. And if they're putting in 13 times as much in defense and security and military than they are in education and healthcare, citizens should be asking questions and saying, wait a second, what's our priority again? What are we saying to the world about what matters in a cooperative globe? What are we saying? So the first is really hold that power and that agency and use it. Demand more from our governments. Demand that we actually start investing in education instead of just the lip service that we always hear very frequently from many governments around the world about the importance of education. The second thing is within our own personal spaces, ask what our communities are doing. I mean, conflicts exist around the world, but insecurity also exists in our own neighborhoods. So in your own individual capacity, how are you contributing to organizations that are working on this on the ground? Are you contributing to information in your community? Oftentimes, many of us don't take a lot of the information we learn back home and say, this is something we should focus on. And where you have power, be it in the mosque, in the church, in the university, wherever you hold power, try to convene and amplify the importance of this message. So, and a great example I can give is a lot of displaced communities, they will come and oftentimes stay within their community in the country they move to. And all of these challenges end up being replicated. And so, and a good example here is there are Bangladeshi communities in the UK that have lower education and literacy rates than the communities back home. And that's a challenge that the government has now had of how do we address this? And a huge part of it is let's actually talk with communities. Let's have communities leverage their own agency and lift themselves up out of that. And the third thing is, it is, I think, incredibly important for us to be looking at quantity of education, at literacy, et cetera. But it's so important for us if you work in healthcare, or if you work in academia, or if you work in women, peace, and security, to say, how does this connect? What's the connection? What can I do in my space that will actually support education globally? If I am a doctor, how can I look at mental health? Or how can I look at sanitation? How can I look at epidemics and pandemics? How can I look at these entry points to better understand this context? And it might not be an education organization you choose to work with. It might be a health organization that is looking at mental health and conflict. And you might say, this is where I'm gonna invest my time. But it will have a multiplier effect on the education of people on the ground.
Thank you very much. Your Highness, last word.
I think I and my friends here said enough. It's time to hear your voices, your creative opinions. I know that education, above all, created an email for this purpose. I think Dr. DeJoya will circulate this later on. But I want to leave you with a thought. Every time you see a conflict erupt anywhere in the world, please remember that it's not just about construction being demolished, but it's about souls being destroyed, about adding to the number of 750 million illiterate adults. It means increasing the number of traumatized children, increasing the number of indoctrinated minds. This is the invisible consequences of our deeds. This is the uncalculated risks of the conflicts. This is the world that our children and our grandchildren will have to deal with in the future if we don't intervene and protect education. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Her Highness mentioned that an email address and the programs that you picked up on your way in, and if you missed it, they'll be there on your way out. There's an email address where you can send your reflections so that we can keep this conversation going. And we're grateful to you for any thoughts you may have, and please use that address, and we'll be able to share those reflections.
I'm looking forward to hearing your creative responses, please.
I want to invite all of you to join us for a luncheon reception right in the room we call the President's Room, just right outside these doors, and I hope you'll be able to join us for that. And finally, before we leave, please join me in expressing our gratitude to Her Highness and to our guests for being part of such an important panel this morning.